The morning in Brookside unfolded with the kind of peaceful stillness that made you stop and savor it. The sky stretched overhead in a perfect shade of blue, and the narrow sidewalks lining Evergreen Cafe bustled softly with the usual morning crowd. Among the scattered tables sat Ethan Hale, a blind man who visited the cafe daily without fail. By his side, ever watchful, sat Atlas, his devoted German shepherd. Atlas wasn't just a guide dog. His sharp stance and poised demeanor revealed a history few could guess. A former K-9 unit, Atlas had once worked tirelessly in law enforcement. Now retired, his purpose had shifted from chasing criminals to guiding Ethan, offering him not just security, but an unspoken bond that Ethan valued more than words could express. As Ethan quietly sipped his coffee, the gentle hum of conversation and rustling pages of newspapers was suddenly interrupted by the thunderous rumble of approaching motorcycles. 3 bikes pulled into the lot, their engines cutting through the calm like a blade. The cafe-goers shifted in their seats, eyes drawn toward the trio that dismounted. The men wore matching leather jackets patched with vivid insignias, symbols that weren't familiar, but carried weight nonetheless. The leader of the group, Griff, carried himself with a cocky assurance, his broad frame and booming laugh filling the space around him as he spoke animatedly to his companions. His words weren't loud enough to catch, but his exaggerated gestures spoke volumes. Griff's gaze drifted across the tables as he walked, taking stock of the patrons in a way that made a few people lower their eyes. Atlas, whose head had been resting calmly against Ethan's leg, lifted his ears, his gaze locking onto Griff and his crew. The dog's posture shifted, muscles tightening ever so slightly. "Now that's a big dog," Griff commented as his eyes settled on Atlas. His tone was casual, but there was something in the way he stared that made the hair along Atlas's back bristle. Ethan, oblivious to Griff's scrutiny, smiled faintly. "Yeah, he's my best friend." Griff took a step closer, tilting his head as if examining Atlas. "Atlas, huh? Strong name. Greek, right? Let's see if he lives up to it." Before Ethan could respond, Griff bent forward suddenly, extending a hand to touch the dog's snout. Atlas moved back a fraction, releasing a low, almost imperceptible growl. A sound not loud enough for everyone to hear, but sharp enough to pierce the space between Griff and the dog. Griff paused, grinning. "Easy there, buddy," he said, lifting his hands in mock surrender. Ethan, sensing Atlas's shift in posture, frowned and reached down to rest his hand on the shepherd's neck. "You okay, boy?" Ethan asked softly. Atlas responded by edging closer to Ethan's side, his gaze never wavering from Griff. The interaction hadn't gone unnoticed. A few of the other patrons exchanged glances, the air around the cafe growing heavier. Griff's 2 friends chuckled, but there was hesitation in their laughter. "You're gonna let a dog show you like that, Griff?" one of them teased. The comment, though light, seemed to strike a nerve. Griff's grin faded for a moment, replaced by something harder to place. He glanced around, noticing the subtle shift in attention. A few people had discreetly pulled out their phones, the tiny lenses aimed in his direction. Maybe that should have been enough to make him walk away, but Griff wasn't the type to back down from an audience. "Nah, it's just a dog," Griff replied, his voice carrying a dismissive edge. Atlas, however, knew better. There was a difference between harmless playfulness and subtle menace, one he had learned long ago in the field. Ethan, though blind, could feel the way the dog's body tensed beneath his hand. "What's wrong, Atlas?" Ethan whispered. Atlas didn't respond with a sound. He simply kept his eyes fixed on Griff, his unmoving posture a quiet but firm declaration. Griff seemed to pick up on it, and though his smile lingered, the challenge in his eyes sharpened. He reached out again, this time not for Atlas, but for Ethan's shoulder. A light touch that might have seemed harmless to an outsider. Atlas rose immediately to his feet, stepping between Griff and Ethan in one fluid motion. His low growl, louder this time, cut through the cafe like a knife. Griff took a step back, lifting his hands once more. All right," he said with a smirk that barely concealed his frustration. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ethan, still unaware of the full exchange, felt Atlas press against his leg protectively. "Sorry if he startled you," Ethan offered genuinely, though he couldn't shake the lingering unease. "Nah, it's all good," Griff replied. But as he turned away, his friend's snickering followed him. "You sure about that, Griff? Dogs got you spooked." Griff's hand clenched at his side, but he said nothing. He caught one last glance at Atlas, who hadn't moved an inch, his sharp eyes tracking Griff until he finally returned to his bike. As the motorcycles roared back to life, Ethan gently patted Atlas's head. "Good boy," he murmured, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. Atlas didn't relax until the sound of the engines faded into the distance. Griff took a few slow steps back, but it wasn't retreat. His friends lingered nearby, laughing louder, egging him on with teasing remarks that seemed to sting more than entertain. The biker's pride, already bruised, flickered behind his grin. He stopped in front of Atlas, locking eyes with the German shepherd, as if daring him to react. Ethan, still unaware of the threatening glances or the subtle shift in the atmosphere, tried to soften the mood with a light chuckle. Atlas doesn't like it when people get too close too fast. Maybe that startled him. He offered. His words were calm, but his hand unconsciously tightened on the dog's harness. Griff, ignoring the remark, flicked his gaze between his friends and the nearby tables. Some patrons were watching quietly. Others had pulled out their phones, recording just in case. Griff's lips curled into a smirk, and with a cool, deliberate step, he approached Ethan's table again, reaching his hand out. Atlas, still sitting but visibly tense, let out a low growl. It was subtle, but unmistakable to those who understood the language of dogs. A warning. Griff's fingers hovered for a second before he pulled them back with an exaggerated shrug. "Come on, big guy," he said with a forced laugh. "Let's see if you're as tough as you look." Before Atlas could react further, Griff gave the side of Ethan's chair a light but intentional nudge with his boot. That was all it took. Atlas rose instantly, body shifting into high alert, standing like a coiled spring ready to release. His sharp eyes locked onto Griff, and the growl in his throat deepened, echoing louder than before. Around them the cafe's chatter dimmed. A few onlookers leaned forward, curious but cautious. Ethan, sensing the sudden tension in Atlas's body, furrowed his brow and traced his hand over the dog's neck, feeling the rigid posture beneath his touch. "What's going on, Atlas?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet concern. Griff chuckled nervously but didn't move back. He seemed to understand the line he had just crossed, yet something in him refused to let it go. "We're just messing around," Griff called out with an easy smile, though his tone faltered slightly. At that moment, a woman at the next table rose to her feet. Her eyes narrowed, and she placed her hands on her hips. "Hey, that's enough," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Leave the dog alone." For the first time, Griff hesitated. His smirk faded as his eyes darted toward the woman. He glanced around, noticing the quiet judgment radiating from the crowd. Phones were still pointed at him. Atlas didn't budge, his eyes fixed on Griff, ready for any sudden movement. The dog wasn't just watching, he was calculating. Griff's jaw tensed, but he forced another chuckle. "Relax," he muttered, waving his hand dismissively. "We're just having fun." "Doesn't look like fun from here," the woman shot back. The crowd shifted. A few people exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. Ethan, still unaware of the glares being exchanged, tugged gently at Atlas's leash. "Atlas, calm down," he murmured, though his own pulse quickened with unease. But Atlas didn't relax. His eyes tracked Griff with unwavering focus, head low and steady. Griff's pride tugged at him. His friends whispered under their breath, but he could hear their taunts loud and clear. He hated how the dog seemed to have the upper hand in front of so many people. Pretending to step back, Griff suddenly kicked a metal cafe chair toward Atlas. The chair scraped loudly across the pavement, and a few people gasped. Atlas reacted instantly, sidestepping the chair with swift agility, his growl rising to a sharp bark. The message was clear. The woman stood taller. "Hey, enough," she snapped, louder this time. A couple of other patrons joined in. "Leave them alone." Griff's face twitched, but he tried to play it off. "Seriously, what's the problem? It's just a dog," he said, though his clenched fists betrayed the casual act he tried to maintain. Atlas didn't move from Ethan's side, but the look in his eyes sharpened. Calm but relentless, daring Griff to try anything more. Finally, Ethan caught on to the unease rippling through the cafe. He stood slowly, his hand gripping Atlas's leash firmly. "Can someone explain what's happening?" Ethan asked aloud, his voice clear and steady but tinged with quiet worry. Before anyone could answer, Griff took another step closer, leaning toward Ethan as if to intimidate him. Atlas shifted immediately, pressing closer to Ethan's side, positioning himself between his handler and Griff. The cafe fell silent. Even Griff's friends stopped laughing. Ethan, unaware of Griff's looming posture but sensing the space close between them, stiffened. Griff tilted his head, his voice lowering to a mockingly soft tone. "Hiding behind your dog, huh?" Ethan's fingers curled around Atlas's fur, grounding himself. "Atlas isn't hiding me from anything," he replied. His voice trembled slightly, but didn't waver. "He's protecting me, because he knows something I don't." Atlas's low growl intensified, cutting through the air like a knife. A man at a nearby table, older with a quiet but firm presence, finally stood. "You've gone too far," he said flatly, staring Griff down. "Walk away." Griff glanced at him, but the weight of the cafe's gaze pressed in. The woman who had spoken earlier took a step closer to Ethan, her glare unwavering. Griff exhaled sharply, stepping back with reluctance. "Fine," he muttered. "We're leaving." But as he walked away, the tension in Atlas's posture lingered. The German Shepherd didn't move until Griff's footsteps faded completely. The tension thickened as Griff inched closer to Ethan, his shadow stretching across the cafe's outdoor table. Even though Ethan couldn't see, he could feel the weight of Griff's presence, oppressive and invasive. "What's the matter, buddy? Hiding behind your dog?" Griff sneered, though his laugh carried a slight edge, more forced than before. Ethan's grip on Atlas's leash tightened. Despite the tremor in his voice, he remained steady. "Atlas isn't hiding me from anything," he said calmly. "He's here to protect me. And clearly he knows something I don't." Atlas didn't move, but the low growl rumbling from his chest grew louder with every second Griff lingered. The cafe patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their murmurs growing. The tension had shifted from quiet curiosity to palpable discomfort. Finally, an older man sitting at a nearby table rose, his voice gravely but resolute. "This has gone far enough. You should leave before something happens." Griff's eyes flicked to the older man, narrowing slightly as if sizing him up. The tension in his jaw was visible, but he ignored the advice. His pride, fed by the taunts of his friends and the stares of the cafe crowd, refused to let him back down. Then, the silence shattered. Atlas barked, loud, commanding, and impossible to ignore. Griff instinctively took a step back, his confidence wavering for the first time. The bark carried weight, not just a warning, but a promise of action. The cafe fell quiet, save for the soft clicks of phone cameras capturing the moment. Ethan straightened slightly, feeling Atlas's leash tremble under his hand. "Atlas, it's okay. I'm fine," he said softly, though his heart raced. Atlas didn't relax. His eyes stayed locked on Griff, ears pinned forward, muscles coiled beneath his sleek fur. He didn't trust Griff, not for a second. Trying to reclaim his pride, Griff let out a dismissive chuckle. "Relax, man. It's just a dog." But as Griff reached out to give Ethan's shoulder a light shove, Atlas moved like lightning. In an instant, the German Shepherd stepped directly between them, pressing his body against Ethan while baring his teeth just enough to make his point. He didn't lunge. He didn't need to. The warning was crystal clear. Griff froze. The confidence he'd worn like armor cracked, and for a moment, his eyes met Atlas's with something close to hesitation. Ethan's head lifted slightly. He could sense the change, though he couldn't see the look on Griff's face. "I think it's best if you leave now," Ethan said, his voice firmer. The crowd murmured in agreement, the shift in support unmistakable. Griff glanced around, realizing the tables had turned. His friends had fallen silent, and a few patrons shook their heads in disapproval. Phones were still recording, capturing his hesitation for anyone to see. Without another word, Griff slowly backed away, masking his embarrassment with a forced smirk. His friends followed suit, and within seconds, the group disappeared around the corner, their motorcycles roaring to life in the distance. The cafe exhaled collectively, the once calm morning now tinged with leftover tension. Ethan crouched next to Atlas, running his hand along the dog's back, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his chest. Atlas's front paws trembled faintly beneath him. "It's okay now, Atlas," Ethan whispered, stroking the shepherd's fur. But Atlas's gaze remained fixed on the street, his ears twitching. It was as if he knew something Ethan didn't. A soft voice broke the quiet. The woman who had confronted Griff earlier stepped closer, her expression gentle but concerned. "Are you all right?" Ethan nodded, though the crease in his brow betrayed him. I'm fine. But Atlas, he's never reacted like this before. He knows when something's wrong, and I trust that. The woman knelt to meet Atlas's eyes, observing the steady intensity in them. This dog, he's not ordinary, is he? Ethan sighed, a mix of pride and nostalgia in his voice. No. Atlas used to be K9, trained to protect, serve, and put himself in harm's way if needed. But that was years ago. I thought he left all that behind. Now he's my guide, my family. The woman nodded thoughtfully, as if piecing something together. Maybe he never forgot who he was, she murmured. The older man who had spoken up earlier approached, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Son, he began, his voice carrying quiet authority. Dogs like that. They don't react without reason. Trust him and be careful. That man, Griff, he doesn't seem like the kind to let things go. Ethan rose to his feet, gently tightening his hold on Atlas's leash. The shepherd looked up at him, their connection needing no words. Then, in the distance, the low hum of motorcycle engines returned, not close, but not gone. Ethan's grip firmed. I will, he said softly. Atlas's tail flicked, but his attention never wavered from the direction Griff had gone. His body stayed tense, a silent sentinel by Ethan's side. Ethan patted Atlas's head once more. Come on, boy, let's head home. But as they walked away from the cafe, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Atlas's instincts weren't wrong. This wasn't over. Ethan took a slow breath, running his fingers through Atlas's fur. Maybe I'm just overthinking this, he thought, but the faint tremor he felt beneath his hand told a different story. What Ethan didn't realize was that this uneasy moment was only the start of something much larger. Something that would test not only Atlas's loyalty, but Ethan's resilience in the face of the unexpected. The tension outside the cafe seemed to settle, but not for Atlas. Though he lay beside Ethan now, his breathing remained uneven, his ears flicking at every minor sound. Sensing his restlessness, Ethan decided it was time to leave. He gathered Atlas's leash and rose from the table, flashing a nervous smile toward the few people who lingered. Thanks for keeping an eye out, he said softly. Atlas and I could use some air. The two stepped onto the sidewalk, falling into their familiar rhythm. The walk home was part of their routine, but today each step felt heavier. The usual comfort of Atlas's presence was laced with an undercurrent of tension that Ethan couldn't ignore. Atlas's paws padded softly along the pavement, the jingle of his leash filling the silence between them. Ethan couldn't see the world around him, but he didn't need to. Atlas's stiff posture told him everything he needed to know. By the time they reached Ethan's small apartment, Atlas's alertness hadn't waned. As Ethan unclipped the leash, Atlas moved methodically through the space, sniffing every corner, as if searching for something unseen. You're acting weird today? Ethan mused, feeling for Atlas's water bowl on the counter. But Atlas didn't respond as he usually would. Instead, he sat by the door, head high, ears perked, listening. Ethan frowned. Atlas? He stepped closer, gently resting his hand on the dog's back. You never do this? What's going on? Ethan lowered himself onto the couch, his thoughts swirling. He remembered the sparse details he knew of Atlas's past. Stories of his time as a canine, his sharp instincts, the lives he had protected. Ethan never pried for more. It wasn't the dog's past that mattered to him. It was the bond they shared now. But tonight, those instincts seemed to resurface. Are you trying to tell me something, boy? Ethan murmured, stroking Atlas's fur. The shepherd's tail wagged faintly, but his eyes stayed pinned to the door. Then, almost too quiet to notice, a distant rumble drifted in from the street. A motorcycle. Atlas's head lifted sharply, his muscles coiled beneath his sleek coat. Ethan couldn't hear it, but the reaction in Atlas was impossible to miss. His fingers trailed over the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension ripple through him. Whatever it is, we're in this together, Ethan whispered. Little did Ethan know, those words were a promise he'd have to keep sooner than he thought. The evening settled over the neighborhood, wrapping the streets in stillness. Ethan sat at his modest dining table, slicing an apple in silence. Atlas lay nearby, but the calm didn't reach him. His ears flicked at even the faintest sound. Ethan ran his hand gently along Atlas's side. Maybe I'm imagining things, huh? But Atlas didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the front door. The quiet broke. The soft hum of engines returned, distant at first, but growing louder, more distinct. Atlas stood abruptly, his body stiff as he stared at the door. Ethan froze. Atlas? What is it? His voice dropped, suddenly uneasy. The engine stopped. Silence filled the room like a heavy fog. Ethan's heart thudded against his ribs. His fingers hovered over his phone. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. Then, 3 sharp knocks. Atlas growled, stepping between Ethan and the door, his posture rigid. Ethan hesitated, gripping the leash. "Who is it?" he called, keeping his tone firm but wary. No response, only faint murmurs, as if someone was speaking just out of reach. Ethan's pulse quickened. He could feel Atlas's tension through the leash, the shepherd ready to defend if necessary. "I'm not opening the door unless you say who you are," Ethan declared, his voice loud enough to carry through the wood. For a moment, nothing. Then, "Relax, man. It's just me. Griff." Ethan stiffened, ice trickling down his spine. Atlas barked, a sharp, commanding sound that rattled through the small apartment. Ethan instinctively stepped back, pulling Atlas with him. "What do you want, Griff?" The voice on the other side softened, trying to sound casual, but the undercurrent of menace was unmistakable. "Just wanted to talk. No hard feelings about earlier, right?" Ethan didn't answer right away. His mind raced, weighing his options. Atlas didn't move, his growl low and unwavering. "You need to leave, Griff," Ethan said finally, his grip tightening on the leash. Ethan stood by the window, his hand resting lightly on Atlas's back, as the faint sound of Griff's footsteps faded into the night. The murmurs outside slowly quieted, but neither Ethan nor Atlas relaxed. Something about the encounter felt unfinished, like distant thunder hinting at an approaching storm. Atlas remained by the window, his large frame outlined against the dim glow of the street lamp outside. His eyes scanned the darkness, nose twitching as he sniffed the cool air drifting through the slightly cracked window. "What is it, Atlas?" Ethan whispered, his fingers tightening slightly on the dog's fur. His unease grew with each second of silence, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that Griff wasn't done, that the man was circling, watching. Minutes later, the soft padding of footsteps broke the stillness. They were slow, deliberate. Ethan couldn't hear them, but Atlas's reaction said everything. The dog tensed, his ears tilting toward the sound as his body coiled like a spring. A sharp bark erupted from Atlas, piercing the quiet apartment. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his phone on the counter, his fingers fumbling as he dialed. "Stay calm," he told himself, though his heart slammed against his ribs. Atlas positioned himself at the door, his growl deep and steady, vibrating through the room like a low rumble of thunder. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone outside my apartment," Ethan said, his voice tight. I think they're trying to get in." His grip on Atlas's leash tightened as the dog's growl rose. "My dog is trained. He wouldn't react like this unless something was wrong." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher instructed calmly. "Officers are on their way." Ethan nodded, though no one could see him. "Thank you." Outside, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, a soft scraping sound against the window pane. Ethan's stomach dropped. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled Atlas closer, backing toward the far side of the living room. The scrape stopped suddenly, followed by a quiet, muffled curse from the other side of the glass. Atlas barked again, louder this time, his body pressing firmly against the door as if daring whoever was outside to try. Ethan swallowed hard. He felt helpless, relying on Atlas's instincts and the hope that the police would arrive in time. "They're coming, Atlas," Ethan murmured, his free hand stroking the dog's back, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure more, himself or the dog. Finally, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night, growing louder until red and blue lights danced through the window. The footsteps outside stopped abruptly. A few seconds later, the sound of someone running, heavy boots pounding against the pavement, replaced the slow, deliberate circling. Atlas's growl softened but didn't disappear entirely. His gaze stayed pinned to the door, ready for whatever came next. Ethan exhaled shakily as he spoke into the phone. "They're here. Thank you." Relief washed over him, though he knew this wasn't over. Griff had crossed a line tonight, and Ethan suspected he'd do it again. 2 police officers approached the building as Ethan opened the door, feeling the cool night air brush against his face. Atlas remained at his side, his body still stiff and alert. "Evening, sir. Everything okay now?" one of the officers asked, stepping into the apartment. Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the lingering fear. "Thank you for coming." Atlas's sharp eyes scanned the perimeter, his ears flicking toward every small sound. He didn't relax, and that kept Ethan on edge. "Can you tell us what happened?" the second officer asked, pulling out a notepad. Ethan recounted the events, Griff's appearance at the cafe, the tension, and the footsteps that followed him home. As he spoke, his hand rested lightly on Atlas's back, grounding him. "He didn't do anything physical," Ethan admitted, "but I know he's not done. I can feel it, and so can Atlas." The first officer knelt by Atlas, extending his hand carefully. "Your dog's instincts are sharp," he said after a moment. "If he's this on edge, it's worth staying cautious." The second officer stepped outside, scanning the area with a flashlight. After a few minutes, he returned, his expression neutral. "We found fresh footprints by your window," he said. "Trail leads off toward the alley, but no sign of anyone now." Ethan's stomach tightened. "He's probably long gone," the officer continued, "but we'll increase patrols around the area. If you hear or sense anything else, call immediately." Ethan nodded, his hand curling tighter around Atlas's leash. "Thank you, but I'm not leaving. This is our home." The officers exchanged a glance before one replied, "Understood. Just be careful." After the officers left, the apartment felt heavier with silence. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, Atlas lying near his feet. He reached down, running his hand through Atlas's fur. The dog hadn't left the front door since the officers arrived. "I don't know what's coming, Atlas," Ethan whispered, "but I know you'll be ready." Atlas's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. For the first time that night, his tail gave the faintest wag, a small moment of comfort in the lingering unease. Ethan finally laid back, closing his eyes. Sleep came in fragments, brief, restless moments that dissolved into awareness. Atlas remained by the door, his eyes never closing. Whatever Griff was planning, Atlas would be there. Ethan wouldn't face it alone. Atlas wasn't just a guide dog, nor just a retired canine. He was a guardian, a steadfast partner, and a constant reminder that true strength wasn't found in standing alone, but in standing together.